Lovely to see so many. My name is Susan Banky. I'm an associate professor in the University of Sydney, and I'm really quite honored to be introducing this panel, Developing Rights-Based Refugee Governance in Southeast Asia, Situations and Challenges. This is jointly sponsored by the Sydney Southeast Asia Center and BRIN, which is the National Research and Innovation Agency of Indonesia, and PRP, which stands for Pusat Riset Politik. I am coming to you from Gadigal land, the Eora Nation. I acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. We are all coming from a lot of different places, and it's wonderful to have us all. I try to say these in ways which are meaningful, which is to say we are all on land that comes from people that preceded us, and to just have a moment in our minds to acknowledge that and to say to ourselves how fortunate we are to be on that land, and to ensure that we remember the elders and the custodians who have cared for that land. Okay, it's my great pleasure that we're going forward. We have a really terrific panel of speakers who are going to talk about these issues of refugee governance in Southeast Asia. Never has there been a time which this seems more important potentially than now, given the political environment both in the region and internationally. And we have terrific speakers who will be talking about that. I'm going to immediately pass it on to Ibu Atika, who will begin and offer a greater introduction. Thank you to so many of you that have come. Thank you, Ibu Atika.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Susan, for your kind introduction. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good morning from Jakarta, Indonesia. Your Excellency, the Director of the Sydney Southeast Asia Center at the University of Sydney, Australia, distinguished speakers, Associate Professor Alexandra McCormick and Tamra Megau from the University of Sydney, also Professor Trinuke Pujiastuti and Rizka Afiani Prabangnintias, our prominent researchers at the Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN Indonesia. Last but not least, Mas Gading Putra from GRS Indonesia, also our distinguished moderators, Associate Professor Susan Banky from the University of Sydney, and Fauzan Farhana, our researcher from BRIN. And thank you, Prof. Susan, also for your kind introduction. Distinguished participants, colleagues from Research Center for Politics, BRIN, and audience, esteemed guests, scholars who joined through the Zoom meeting. Welcome to our joint webinar on developing rights-based refugee governance in Southeast Asia, situation and challenges. This webinar is presented by the research team on forced migration at the Research Center for Politics, BRIN, and the Sydney Southeast Asia Center at the University of Sydney, Australia. And it is such a privilege for us to host today's webinar. I would like to commence by, expressing my gratitude for your efforts in elevating our collaboration with the University of Sydney. I think it's fantastic that we are building on our shared interest and knowledge on refugee governance in Southeast Asia as the basis for today's webinar. In general, the objective of this webinar are not only to facilitate a deeper understanding of refugee governance and human rights in Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, but also to promote collaborative research and dialogue between scholars from BRIN and the University of Sydney. Specifically, today, we will explore the complex landscape of refugee protection in this dynamic region where, diverse socio-political contexts and humanitarian needs intersect. So our discussion will focus on the current state of refugee governance, the challenges in implementing right-based frameworks and pathways toward inclusive and durable solution. And through this lively discussion, we will learn from one another by exchanging valuable viewpoints on the complexities, challenges, and opportunities on how to develop right-based refugee governance in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And we at BRIN are eager to find new ways to strengthen our work with the University of Sydney and to ensure we are delivering the best results for our country and societies. And in particular, we are keen to develop more collaboration with universities and research institutions in Southeast Asia, Australia, and maybe other parts of the world. I think that's all for me. Thank you again for joining us in this critical dialogue to advance dignity and justice for refugees in Southeast Asia. And also thank you for all your efforts in preparing this important webinar. Finally, we are extremely grateful for our academic partnership, and we look forward to our next fruitful collaboration. Hope you enjoyed the webinar. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Prof. Susan. I return to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, that was a lovely introduction. We're going to go ahead and start the next panel where we talk about refugee governance for human rights. We're going to ask about the case of access to education, first for refugee children in Indonesia, and then education for forced migrants in North Thailand. We know that these are related issues, given kind of the political environment in Southeast Asia. So I'd like to begin by introducing please forgive me if I don't have the pronunciation exactly right, but Prabhaningtyas, the researcher from BRIN, Rizka Prabhaningtyas. How did I do there?
You pronounce it perfect, Prof. Susan. But I think if I'm not mistaken, in the rundown, I think Prof. Nuka would give a little bit introduction or presentation about the context of Southeast Asia. I'm sorry if I just read the TOS.
I'm so sorry I failed at my first job of the moderator, which was reading the schedule closely. Please forgive me. It's really a great honor instead to begin with Trinuke Pujastuti, yes, who is going to offer the introduction to the entire issue. Please forgive me. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Susan. Don't worry about that. Tamara, would you help me to please share my screen? Okay, good morning, all participants, especially to our dear colleagues from Sydney University, Professor Alex, Professor Susan, of course, Tamara Mikol, and my colleagues from Indonesia, Atika, Mas Gading, Rizka, and also Fauzan, and distinguished participant. Thank you for this opportunity. It's a really honor for me to share knowledge with you all. Of course, because my talk is an introduction, so I will talk very short, only in the important point. I do hope not take a lot of time. The point is the rightful meaning of refugee in Southeast Asia. An introduction, please. Next. Yeah, I think all of us know that there were more than 280,000 today refugee and asylum seeker in Southeast Asia. And we know also that the primary refugee generating countries in the region are Myanmar and Vietnam, while the primary refugee hosting nations or most affected countries are Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, which house more than 99% of refugee and asylum seekers in Southeast Asia. The causes are interrelated and create a vulnerable situation. If we look at the Southeast Asia data, there are only 3 countries that have ratified the Refugee Convention. They are Cambodia, Philippines, and Timor-Leste. Next. Yes, the dynamic in Southeast Asia, I think Southeast Asia in the modern era has a long history and culture of kind of mobility. There are three key episodes of the forced migrations from mainland Southeast Asia. We know that both people from Indochina at the time, and then from other regions from Southeast Asia around I think the main issue is we can see the Tampa affair in 2001, which carrying 400, for more than 400 rescue refugees. And the third period is about Myanmar, I think start 1980 until present. And we know that the strong sign of the extension of Andaman Sea crisis in 2015 was the major event, and then lead the political controversy and also make Australia with a new border protections policy. Even though the number is still around 300,000, forced migrations become increasing complex into this century. Escalations of the conflict and persecutions has led to create the creations of large populations of forced migrations, both within and cross-border, both within into Southeast Asia. To scout and ensure violent and are forced to flee persecutions and many kind, not only male, but mostly with the women, children, and elderly. In the dynamic, the last point of the dynamic is actually we know that many countries in Southeast Asia, we know that many nations hoods seems particularly pressing throughout history, violence, conflict, and has been a common when the complex competing nations of statehood and the nationhood are fiercely contested. And you know that the challenges are what's actually the policy that are definite and uncooperative, or at the best ambivalent or non-transparent. So I think forced migrations in many ways is not a high politic in the national and also regional, but there are many good practices as a good modality which have done by international organizations, CSO, particularly in Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Next. Yes, when we talk about the challenges of governance, actually, the most effective country are Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, all are not signatory refugee convention. And you know that Indonesia is the only country adopt the terminology and definitions of refugee asylum seeker. Unfortunately, the presidential regulations only talk about the ad hoc action, not about the prolonged situations. Thailand, yes, Thailand has the national screening mechanism, but it is mostly focused on the children and educations, not others. So we can see that there are many discriminations also there. And Malaysia, refugees are treated as same as undocumented migrant under Malaysian law, even though there are some progress today, but still very hard for refugee in Malaysia to get their rights. Next. Yeah, as I said before, many good practices in access to education, health, and livelihood among stakeholders, but still lack of the formal legal protections. So we can see the vulnerable people, I mean the vulnerable refugee in those countries actually still very hard to get many access. Most of them, I mean, the governments still lack of coordinations and collaborations among stakeholders internally. In terms of the and externally, we know that burden sharing and share responsibility in the regional, international is very important, but it's still very hard to get any protection from regional and internationally. We know that Indonesia and Australia actually co-chair of Bali process, but Bali process still very hard move on because often influenced by national interests of each. Meanwhile, ASEAN does not have a specific policy on refugee and asylum seeker. Also, ASEAN has declarations of human rights, ICHR, but ASEAN mostly pays more attention to the categories of trafficking in person and IDPs, not refugee and asylum seeker. So it's very hard to how to develop the governance in Southeast Asia. So we can see that also there are a lot of vulnerable physical and mentally because of the prolonged situations, because the conditions without any enough access and basic right. Become the object. They also become the object of corruptions. Many of places we can see refugee is the target of the corruption, not only in the society but also in some part of government. Their mobility actually mixed with the transnational organized crime activity. So we can see how mixed migrations enters or happen in Southeast Asia again. With the complexity and various problems, their mobility generally move from location to locations for a long period of time, often with the help of smugglers and traffickers. Next. I think this is the last slide. Yeah. Talking about how to protect them, I think, currently we are trapped in the emerging situations of the forced migrations. I mean, the refugee and asylum seekers entering the affected country. But there is something bigger. Those who have been waiting for a long time in the host country, formally calculated by UNHCR around 5 until 10 years, which is actually some of them more than 10 years. The prolonged situations of each country is different. It is influenced by the country perspective and policy in the issue. Actually, there are some key rights that should be taken into account. Right to recognize as refugee, it's a very important. I think we have a good practices also from Australia, how to recognize them as a refugee. Non-refoulement, it is a very important, even though in the formal, some countries already said that no refoulement, but still happen in many. Right to protections and also right to education, health, and empowered. It is very important because they can't get any activity as for work, and also sometimes it's very hard to get their access help. So within the social, economic, and cultural right, I think is a very important to recognize as a key right. If these key rights, and I think all of the speaker will talk about that one, I think this framework that human rights as the foundations for policies and action, it shifts the focus from solely address problems to ensuring the realizations of human rights. Durable solution is more potential accessible because we empower the refugee and asylum seekers, and then they can go to the third country. And the last one is a very important, is refugee life as a human being with dignity. I will stop here. Thank you. Back to Professor Susan.
Thank you so much, Professor Nuke Pujiastuti. That was a really terrific and short overview. I appreciate that you've given us some historical sense. Those of us that are on this Zoom call know that the Southeast Asia region has been host to refugees over time, but I very much appreciate that you've brought that to our attention. I would just add that we know that there are so many countries of the global north that are responsible for those refugee displacements in the Southeast Asia region. And it's something that I think all of us that care about refugee rights need to keep in the back of our minds, because while the movements that we're talking about occurred in Southeast Asia, the genesis was something that was far greater, structural issues that of course had to do with geopolitics. And I just wanted to mention one other thing because of your terrific remarks, which is that you make the excellent point that service coordination has not been, service delivery has not been very well coordinated. I know that that will be the topic of some of our upcoming speakers, but it is important and sobering to know that while the coordination has not been very strong on the service provision angle, it has been extraordinarily effective on the security angle. So when it comes to trying to keep refugees out of certain countries, Australia is very capable, for example, of getting in there and creating a lot of coordination mechanisms that stop refugees from moving as we would like them to, or to be able to safely do. So thank you for a really terrific overview. Okay, now I'd like to return to what I said 10 minutes ago, and again, forgive me, where we're going to be looking at questions about the provision of education. And we have two terrific speakers. The first is Buriska, who is going to speak about the provision of education delivery in Indonesia. Thank you. We look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you, Prof. Susan. Good morning, everyone. First of all, please allow me to share my screen first. Can you see it clearly now, the slides? Perfect. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. It is an honor for me to be here with other distinguished speakers. My name is Rizka, and I represent my forced migration research team from Research Center for Politics, BRIN, Indonesia. And today I would like to share our thoughts and research about refugee governance and human rights, the case of education for refugee children in Indonesia. So I would like to start with explaining why we are interested in discussing the issue of education for refugee children in Indonesia. Because we see that the protracted refugee situation in Indonesia recently has increased the vulnerability of refugee children due to the non-fulfillment of their fundamental rights, including the rights on education. While in fact, fulfillment of educational rights for them plays a very crucial protective role for refugee children living in transitory context and time of crisis, giving them a sense of normalcy and stability during an uncertain lengthy period of waiting time for resettlement. And as we know, the number of refugees in Indonesia as of 2025 now is around 12,000 people registered with UNHCR, of whom 29% are children. And Indonesia, as a transit country, tend to have an ambivalent response toward the presence of refugees. At one time, our national government and local community can be very benevolent to refugees, but at the other times, they tend to have a more negative perspective, perceptions, and symptoms toward the presence of refugees in the local community. So in the absence of effective refugee governance that center on human rights protection, the handling of refugees, including their children, remains ad hoc and relies on the narrative of humanity. So if we understand refugee governance as the systems, frameworks, and process used to manage and provide for refugees, including their legal status, rights, and access to resources, then we could see refugee governance in Indonesia context as follows. First, while Indonesia is not the signatory party of 1951 Refugee Convention, Indonesia has ratified various international human rights instruments, which thus oblige Indonesia to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of anyone, particularly those within its jurisdiction. Also, it is important to note that the non-involvement, non-penalization, and non-discrimination, as just has also explained by Prof. Nuka, is customary international law of which states abide to despite non-participation on refugee treaty. So based on this, there is a national context, national policy that Indonesia finally have in 2016, which is the presidential regulation in 2016, which until now remain the only regulation which serves as legal basis for refugee handling in Indonesia. However, this policy is inadequate and still lacks of comprehensive right-based approach, as it is based on a view of refugees issue in emergency context. A more comprehensive regulation is required, particularly where there are various actors involved and need to have a more effective cooperating framework for better shared responsibility mechanism. So if we talk about right to education for refugee children in Indonesia, if you look at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, of which Indonesia is the ratifying country, we have the obligation to guarantee free compulsory primary education for all, the duty bearers. And as a response, the Ministry of Education, Culture, Research, and Technology in 2019, after a long of negotiating process, finally had to issue the circular letter that allow refugee children to enroll in formal school in Indonesia under several terms and conditions, such as long as they are registered to UNHCR and having permission from detention center. But this condition is no longer there. It is omitted in the revised letter in 2022. And the children also have to have a guaranteeing agency such as the IOM or UNHCR for them to support their activities at schools. It is also important to note the pandemic context in the provision of education for refugee children in Indonesia, because the occurrence of COVID pandemic since 2020 multiplies the vulnerability of refugees and challenges in realizing the early implementation of the circular letter, because the circular letter was issued in 2019 and it's just about a year later the pandemic happened. So schools, education office should adapt it with the pandemic occurrence while they have to enroll the refugee children at the same time. So our research in 2022 bring the question of what is the situation and challenges of providing access to education for refugee children in Indonesia, and how is the relationship between actors in handling and fulfilling their rights. We took the case studies of Batam and Makassar, which in 2021 had a substantial population of refugee children who had enrolled in formal education under the auspices of IOM. Our focus is refugee children enrollment in formal education in public and private schools in both cities. So our research findings has been published in Advances in Southeast Asia's journal. So if you want to look more on details about our findings, you can just access the journal article. But in this presentation, I will just like give the lesson learned of our findings and the relations with the refugee governance and human rights development right now. So we took the theoretical framework as elements of accessibility, in which we see that at least there are 4 elements that needs to be looked into if you want to provide education for refugee children, which is the information availability, learning process and activities, environmental support, and the personal motivation from the refugees themselves. So this is the snapshot of situation in Batam and Makassar. What I want to highlight here is that actually the good practices to provide formal education for refugee children in Makassar and Batam has existed prior to the pandemic. But at that time, prior to the pandemic and the circular letter, there remained a lot of uncertainty on whether it is allowed for the schools and the education office to support refugees and to what extent the service should be provided. In Makassar, some formal schools have provided education access for refugees on 2018, before the issuance of circular letter. But meanwhile, the first intake of refugee children to formal schools in Batam is after the circular letter in January 2020, just right before the pandemic. So at a date as of June 2022, the children enrolled in Batam is around 45 students, which 90% are in preschool and public and elementary school. And in Makassar is around 173 students spread over in preschool, elementary, junior, and senior high school. So our finding firstly see that insufficient availability of information is crucial for both refugee children and the education provider to enabling the provision of education for them. The issuance of circular letter provided a practical guideline and legal basis for local government and schools, as before they were unsure whether to accept refugee children or not due to administrative barriers such as identity documents and financial supports. However, after the circular letter, the local authorities remain highly reliant and dependent to international organizations, mostly IOM, to bridge communication with and provide information to the refugee community. So the school are really directly building the communication with the refugee community themselves. They would rely on IOM to share information about schools or anything needed with the IOM. As for the refugee community, also do that to communicate with the school and to help them to deal with any difficulties in school. So we see that in current situation, limited resources and capabilities of international organization means that Indonesian government at national and local level should start owning the responsibility independently. And if we talk about the educational activities and learning process, it is clear that COVID pandemic has heightened the complexities of implementing the circular letter, which has only been disseminated on 2019. Because distance learning system presented several obstacles, not only for students and parents, but also for teachers and schools. The utilization of technology as adaptation strategies is like two coin sides. Like the online school learning helps refugee students to stay engaged, but at the same time, it also exacerbates language barrier and the adaptation process. The usage of devices like laptop and handphones, for some refugees it can help, but not all refugees has the same access to this technological device. So the question here is how to provide equal and inclusive education and teaching facilities with the local and refugee situation without creating exclusivity or burdening some teachers. Because sometimes it's only the English teacher that can engage with the refugees because they have a good proficiency on language. And also the question of deal with high turnover rate, because most refugee children find it difficult to adapt with the educational activities and learning process in schools. About the complex environmental support, we see that it is important to have a multi-stakeholder approach to create inclusive environment support, but the state support for education policy remains limited because the 2016 presidential regulation have not clearly expressed about the right of education, and the circular letter itself lacks external legal binding forces as it only compels within the education ministry and its offices. Besides, the role of refugee families and local communities in supporting their children also varies and limited. As a consequence, again, the over-reliance to IOM make it very hard to make this mechanism of providing regulation become more balanced in share responsibility mechanism. So the fourth factor is the fluctuate motivation. We find that there are two crucial factors that affect refugee children motivation to pursue education in formal schools. The first is local student receptiveness and school teachers' language ability. These two factors appeared frequently during our interviews with the refugees, children, with the parents as well, that the active engagement with refugee children to allow them to voice their need is also crucial in building their confidence and motivation during following the educational activities at school. So in the current situation, we think that initiative and cooperation between schools, parents, and the government is needed to ensure that refugee children can not only access the primary lesson, but also can join the extracurricular extra lessons during the time at schools. So if you would like to reflect our findings to the refugee governance and human rights in Indonesia, we say that even during the difficult times of pandemic in Indonesia, and while formal education was for many years not clearly regulated for children, Indonesian government became more receptive to granting refugee children access to formal education. However, this study also demonstrated that the pandemic has compounded challenges for realizing access to education for refugee children. There are some adaptation strategies to overcome this obstacle, but then again, to every refugee, the case would be very different. It really depends on the resource that they have and the persistence from the refugees' sites as well, to then they are able to enjoy, or they're able to utilize the opportunities that is open to them right now. To ensure the continuance of progress and on education provision for refugee children, Indonesia government need to formalize the ad hoc access to education into something more permanent through a more recognized right-based approach on the revision of the presidential regulation 2016. However, if you talk about the future of refugee governance in Indonesia and its implication to the provision of educational rights, well, we understand that a human rights approach and a multi-stakeholder approach also should be the basis on finalizing the revision of presidential regulation. We are now facing the pending revision of the national regulation, which clearly shows that refugee issues remains under prioritized, just like what Prof. Nuko also highlighted in her presentation before. But in the light of the declining support from international organizations, and Prof. Susan also highlighted that there is a bigger geopolitics under play here, but in fact the refugees still living desperately, waiting for a more a clearer future in Indonesia. So refugee governance in Indonesia can no longer be ad hoc and relies on the narrative of humanity and relies on the role of the international organization to ensure a more sustainable provision of rights, including the educational rights for refugee children. So I think that's all that I can share for now. I'm afraid that I'm taking much more time if I continue. So I'm open to discussion with all of you after the presentation session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bu Rizka. That was wonderful and comprehensive. And again, for those of us that care about refugee service delivery and refugee rights, we know that often it is ad hoc, but you've done a wonderful job of fleshing that out and giving us some details that really see what ad hoc means and what it means for refugees and why it's frankly not sufficient. So thank you so much for that. It's now my honor to introduce my colleague, Associate Professor Alex McCormick, who's going to speak about the challenge of delivering refugee education for refugees in Northern Thailand. Thank you so much, Associate Professor McCormick.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rizka, and also Professor Trina Kapucha-Studi for your comments. I think there's it's a really great lead-in and segue, and I'll first of all begin by, I'll share my screen as well and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you from today, as well as did
Alex, I'm so sorry, before you start, the one thing I forgot to say is that at the end of your speaking, there'll be questions for both of the speakers, so please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And again, forgive me for interrupting. Back to you.
No worries at all. Thank you, Susan. Yes, so I'll emphasize that we're on lands that were never ceded, in paying my respects to elders past and present here at the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. And really, as Susan so eloquently also framed, these are the questions when we're talking about education, knowledges, place, and all the relationships that go with these. This is at the center of all the work that we're doing, you know, on that humanitarian and rights-based perspective that we're looking at today. So it's a slightly different title to what you have. Our focus is on the town of Mae Sot on the Thai-Myanmar borders, and we're a team. The focus of my presentation today, we're at an emergent stage of our research, and we've been building a team across multiple sites, and I'll be looking a bit around those geopolitical dynamics that you mentioned, Susan, and we had that great framing of the regional Southeast Asian context. On this slide here, I just talk a little bit about where we are as members of the team. Myself here at the University of Sydney, our colleague Daniel Couch, who's moved to Southern Cross University further north, and we have a partner, Professor Tejendra Farali in London, who's been working in Mae Sot for a very long time with our partner civil society organization, the Inclusive Education Foundation. We do have our colleague Tinzar in the audience, and she preferred to not be co-presenting, but I'm hoping we will be able to hear from you, Tinzar. I can't see you, but I know you're there, and who really has that lived experience of the situation in Mae Sot and different stages of education, and working as a civil society advocate and provider in education there for many years, and now studying here at the University of Sydney. So we're very lucky to have Tinzar as well. And a doctoral candidate and early career scholar who are also part of this team. And this is all supported by the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre in a collaborative seed grant to build a partnership where we bring together our varying strengths. So I had looked at multi-scalar policy transfer around the rights-based global social programs for education for all, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and looking at civil society work in education within those kinds of parameters that we have, but also looking at decolonial perspectives, critical globalization perspectives, and thinking about the political economies around peace education. So really, we're trying to bring these different areas of expertise that we have to build a team that can be mapping civil society work and potentially look at how that civil society work in education has been changing over time in Mae Sot with the shifts in conflicts in Myanmar, and then also that governance context within Thailand and the greater regional and global levels. So when I say it's emerging, we're designing a longer term study here. So it's a little bit of a different perspective. And I would take your study, Rizka, as a great model for us to also be looking at how we're doing the elements of framing there. And our doctoral candidate, Chawin Pongpajan, has been looking at the Thai context in particular. So he's bringing that insight there as well. But what I'll spend quite a bit of time on today is thinking also about how researchers work in these contexts too, and external, but also how we partner. And we know that some of these words, language can become buzzwords. Many of the words I've already used, globalization, decolonial approaches and processes, these are not straightforward given terms, and they require negotiation, and they require real sensitivity around how we're building the relationships and actually understanding what we interpret these terms as meaning, and what implications they have for the education work that we're doing, for the funding, and for what that allows, and how that can potentially and ideally enable access to rights for education and broader rights. I mean, as you've really highlighted, just that recognition of refugee status, the broader citizenship context that we've already seen coming out just in our initial scopings. But for us, just on that second half of the slide, you can see that idea of building a collaboration that is not a kind of fly in, fly out, benefit to external researchers. It's about a longer term collaboration. We've been really lucky that the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre offered this kind of grant that actually is dedicated to building a study together. So we're still in a phase, we'll be applying for the longer term grant this year, but that process of a co-design and a really reflexive process around how we research, how we even form our questions, how we look at what ethics are. Ethics processes at the University of Sydney in Australia, have very particular aims and parameters, but also local ethics processes. And there's a local ethics group there in MESOT for researchers there. So maybe Tindar might want to speak to that a little bit later, or we can follow up. But that really is a big through line of what I talk about today, is how we've spent time developing the relationships, and so we're still negotiating the questions, even the research questions and methods to come that really honor the work that the team at the Inclusive Education Foundation, as a civil society organization there, partnering with a network of education organizations there, the ways that they prefer to do research and which elements we'll bring. So I'll set a little bit of context here first about Myanmar and the dynamic educational and political context. I know some here are more familiar than I am with these contexts over time, and then certainly how they fit in the regional dynamics, and again, those global geopolitical dynamics. But some of the narratives around these conflicts we're seeing some shifts in spaces that highlight the intersectional layers of power, I suppose, and the scope for voices, and whose rights are being represented here in terms of class, location along the border, and people who are coming into the Thai context, gendered and generational divisions, both within Myanmar and then in the new context that people are being forced into, and in the social and political movements and identities within the civil disobedient movement, ethnic groups, some of those different voices. So when we're thinking about questions of reconciliation in the future, and education models that are coming through as well, all of these have implications. So it's those rights around other lines of identity, group rights as well, that are factors in this, as we've already had said today, extremely complex set of changing context. So it's not the same from moment to moment, and those political aspirations of the different groups and the ways that they're engaging are really important to keep track of. So that's one line of investigation that we've been developing, looking at ethnic groups administering education, and then, as again, we've had acknowledged that prevalence of psychosocial trauma, the role of education there, the experiences that people are bringing, and within civil society groups, those who are delivering and negotiating these contexts are themselves still in very uncertain situations. So this is just offering that, broad stroke context there. Come to MESOT in Thailand, which is just one of the border towns. Again, colleagues might add to this as we get into our discussions. But anecdotally, approximately 2/3 of the population there in MESOT is Myanmar migrants and refugees, with a continued influx as conflicts escalate. And we've seen that over the past year, particularly exacerbated by the conscription law enactment that's seen many more people coming over the borders there. We see that piecemeal policy, as we know, some of the global UN conventions have been signed, but importantly not the Refugee Convention, as we have heard. And even with those concessions that have been made, there are qualifications around national security, which ultimately is often put forward as the line of where rights are actually honored there. So that big question around documentation, recognition as a refugee and a person with rights to services is often really uncertain, and has people living in a situation of insecurity that then has effects as well on educational certification and qualifications, beyond the formal systems, the migrant learning centers, which have very limited funding and recognition, and also rely on, again, the will of people who are, themselves in a really, really complex situation. So while there's some provision, we see it's very limited and it's not formalized and systematic in the way, and we've seen that echoed across the region. INED, the Inclusive Education Foundation, as I said, they engage in local level policy formulation, innovations in education, extensive research, and I'll provide links to the work that they've done. Tinzara's been a co-author, many publications, and have built extensive partnerships, not only with other civil society groups in a really heavily active network there, and along the border, but also with international partnerships. So this will be another plank of the study, is looking at the nature of those partnerships, the financial dimensions, those political economy dimensions, but also what the challenges then are around how much can organizations lead, where is the emphasis on what local groups are able to do in education there. So MESOT is a critical junction of having that range of migrant and refugee communities over a long period of time, extremely frustrating with what we've seen the military junta, do over decades and decades, but also in that bigger historical context of, again, colonization, regional conflict, and then with this really heavy donor and researcher presence, and those motivations around, sometimes with the best of intentions, external actors don't always work in ways that are being led by what is needed, how things are done, both culturally, political, many layers of really thinking through and communicating explicitly and recognizing, formally, those priorities that are there. So a little bit about the kind of the mechanics, what we've been doing as a team in these early stages and we've had to be by distance online for the beginning. So this just began last year around this time, about just a year ago. And the grant enabled us, the idea was we would all learn about each other's context. So we hoped that we could have our INED colleagues come here to Sydney and meet colleagues such as Susan was there, Tamara as well, and be building these partnerships. But the visas were denied by our Australian government. And this was not the first instance. My doctoral student who was living in Bangkok was Burmese student, was refused twice by the government, and these letters that we were seeing really, really offensive wording, really, not trusting and targeting, discriminatory decisions, I think, being made. So that those inequities and denial of mobility rights, I think it was a real shame that we saw not only happen for our Australia-based seminar, but also when it came to going to England, London, similar letters that were really quite harsh. And so, thank goodness for technology, we have been able to build these partnerships, but it's really notable that Professor Farali and I were able to get to MESOT, due to the inequities in our global system around recognition, of rights for refugees and asylum seekers. So that has been one reflection that's really troubled us. We're very fortunate Tinzar has been able to come here through the scholarship that she's on, and we in spite of we've continued, and we've been able to, I think, really honor what this particular kind of grant has been for. And so we've been building various pieces of work that I'll get to in a moment, but I've got here on this slides again just those ethical considerations I mentioned earlier, those distinctions between our institutional approaches here at Sydney and also then local approaches, and those negotiations with our institution around having a co-design process where we can't give them questions that we formed here in Sydney, you know, ahead of starting a project, but that actually doing this together is valuable work, and that we want to do this in a way that we recognize that in meeting with different NGOs in MESOT, you know, there's still insights that can be gained during these stages. So that itself has been an interesting process, and we've yet to go through the local MESOT process, but I think that is going to be the when we're talking about the substantive ethics of how we are conducting the work that we do. That's a priority that we've highlighted there as well. So I think I've already talked through these the actual visiting of each other's locations. When we were there, as I just said, we were able to meet with partners, the Inclusive Education Foundation's team, and to scope whether they might also be involved in the design, you know, and how their insights on how best to be going about that. So this is still ongoing work that we're now distilling into work that analyzes the process that we've been going to, but also is a beginning mapping of this is civil society work in education there over time. And so we had the briefs written by, well, with me, the doctoral candidate, Iris, and also Chawin, who's looking at, as I said, the Thai policy context. I'm not sure how I'm going for time. I'm trying to race through, sorry. Okay. Oh, not, yeah, we've got 2 more slides left, I think. So some of these emerging questions, and these will be what we're distilling into. I've already highlighted the strands around looking at the external actors' work there, looking at those intersectional dynamics youth are facing, and then when we're thinking about education needs of Myanmar youth, and looking also at those barriers and challenges around rights to education, access, qualifications, and as you can see, there's I think we've got it. We're thinking how we distill this down to do. We're looking at hopefully a 5-year grant would be ideal, and then maintaining these partnerships and work that go on. So this slide here is just focusing a little bit more, thinking about the external and international actors. So that multi-scalar work that really is framing and those geopolitical dynamics that can, you know, co-opt or take over the voices that we want to really prioritize for civil society. And a part of it too is also, you know, visibility in international context, Australian context, bringing resources where we can, but not imposing how those are then used and sharing in the research processes there. So I think I've covered here. At the moment, we're working on 2 articles, one around this process and one around the mapping and the state of civil society education work there in MESOT in context. And we hope that we'll have more to share with you along the lines of our very comprehensive, great prior presenter as well. And I look forward to the beginning of many discussions, and hope we can hear from Tinzar as well later on. So many thanks, and yes, looking forward to the rest of this afternoon, this morning's session as well.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's wonderful to see the work that we first were introduced to so long ago coming to fruition with so many interesting parts to it, so much respect, reciprocity, and meaning. Now, I'm mindful that our next session is starting in 4 minutes, and I have questions of my own, but I'd much rather look at the ones in the chat. Can everyone see the ones in the chat, or is it just me that can see them?
Susan, we have a bit of time for questions actually allocated later on, so we can just use like 15 minutes now.
Okay, so we should just do it now rather than later? That's great. Okay.
Do some questions now, and then we'll have 2 more presentations. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, great. So let's see, if we go in order, we've got the question, if schools do not provide enrollment to poor undocumented children, is the alternative work or at-home tutoring? from somebody named HZ. I think that's a question that could be answered by both, but I think it's maybe more. It was asked for Bu Rizka.
Okay, can I just directly answer to it? Thank you, Prof. Susan. Yeah, so I agree that education can take in a lot of different forms, right? Not only the formal education, but the idea of enrolling students to Indonesian education system is actually to utilize the already existing mechanism that is more sustainable in terms of educational provisions. So prior to the enrollment of besides the enrollment of students to formal schools, there have been a lot of other education alternatives for refugee children that was brought by the refugee themselves, which become the refugee-led initiatives for education, or provided by civil society, which sometimes in terms of a more short-term or a more ad hoc basis as well. The problem with this educational provision through alternative form is that they are often less sustainable, and the outcome or the results from this activity sometimes cannot be measured, if you can say. And it really depending on the initiatives of the refugees themselves or the support from the civil societies. And that would be very hard to make it sustainable without the support from the host government too. So on the other hand, it is a little bit difficult for us to expect the Indonesian government to give more financial supports to make another alternative forms of education, such as tutoring or courses, something like that. So because it will cost more money, right? Because it will cost specific financial supports on that. While in fact, Indonesia has no specific costs, a specific budget allocation for handling refugees. So it will after all this time, it still depend heavily on IOM and UNHCR for the handling and for the provision of basic rights. So that's why the idea of enrolling students to the educational system is expected to give more sustainable educational opportunities that will, in the end, although it cannot give the refugees with the certificate like a degree like ijazah, but it can give like letter of completion of education that hopefully they can be utilized by refugees after they were resettled. So that's my answer, Susan.
Thank you so much. I see that we have several more questions for Bu Rizka.
Yep.
So I want to just encourage anyone that has questions. Oh,
Sorry.
Alex, did you want to say something?
Just briefly, I wondered here, and I don't mean to put Tinzar on the spot, but I wonder if Tinzar, you wanted
Please.
to add there anything about the MESOT context for that first question around, or the work that you do at INED as an organization. I see that you should be able to speak, but
Yes, can you guys hear me?
Ken.
Yeah, I think it is a similar situation like in Indonesia. We also have different like alternatives education like provided by local organization. And so Ella's also mentioned in her slide that first we have like migrant learning center, and then but the good things about Thailand for us is they are like allowed to for basic education, they are allowed to join the formal schooling system. So like we also provide if children to be able to enroll into Thai formal school. And then another alternative way is joining the Thai non-formal education program. And yes, some other like online program. And also like lately it has been set up by different like initiative with the university and like different institution. And then it is mostly for like post-secondary level, like that you can join online classes offered by different institution. But one again, like there are also limitation in terms of like access to technology and then like internet and yeah, devices. So thank you.
Thanks so much. I also just wanted to make a sociological comment, which sort of reinforces something that Buriska said, which is that while there's lots of forms of education, the possibility for things like extracurricular activities, for having social engagements with students around you, this builds host and home relationships, and it also provides fertile ground for other kinds of education building, non-official education building. So, you know, that's the reason why these enrollments and kind of a non-ad hoc approach could be so useful to communities both in Thailand and in Indonesia. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to just have a few more questions that we add. We've got for Professor Rizka, I work on stateless Baha'u Laut groups in East Malaysia. Because they're undocumented, they're treated similar. No rights. Interesting that you pointed out the narrative humanity. Please elaborate. And can you please clarify this? If the narrative of humanity as contrasted to which form of rights? I think that is an important question. Is it whether the narrative of humanity is something that kind of you see as a superseding principle over the idea of rights? Is it something about justice? Is it more of a moral argument? So thank you for that question, and we'd love to hear from you on that, Buriska.
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, sorry for not explaining more about the narrative of humanity because the limited time. So maybe hopefully I can just explain what our thoughts on this idea or why we use the narrative of humanity. So we believe that humanity and human rights are intrinsically linked, right? So basically, it's the two things that cannot be separated because the basis of human rights is that we can recognize that people have the human dignity themselves and so on. But sometimes, not sometimes, often, the Indonesia government use the narrative of humanity as a political reasons why they accept refugees. Indonesia accept refugees only based on humanity consideration to address the emergency context, the emergency crisis that is linked to the situation of refugees. So the problem with the argument of humanity or humanitarian that is used by the Indonesian government is that we think it makes everything is just temporary. It's something that is reactive and temporary, and it really depends on the discretive of higher authorities whether they what kind of humanity that they will translate it into. So while on the other hand, we see rights, human rights-based approach is based on the relations, the social justice. A just society requires the protection of human rights, regardless the citizenship, the status, or other issue of human beings. So with the social justice concept on the human rights, everyone's human rights should be respected, protected, and promoted, right? So there is this sense of obligation that that should be bared by the government, not only just because they base their helps to refugees on humanitarian considerations, which makes them can do whatever they want with the and can put refugees issues more under prioritized because the narrative of humanity can really be played by the authorities to the for the sake of the political reasons. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Look, we've got some really terrific questions here, but I think for now, time for only one more. And Tamara, please just let me know if you'd like to change that. But I'd like to put a question forward to Alex from Rafendi Jamin. Hi, Rafendi. It's nice to see you after so many years. Alex, you mentioned informal education from the migrant learning centers. And the question is, has there been any engagement with the Thai Ministry of Education regarding this recognition? Thanks.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for Refendi. And I'll also probably again bring Tinzar, whose experience is well beyond mine. But I will initially say that there has been, to some extent, it's qualified engagement there. And I again, Tinzar might correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that it is not at the national level; it happens at the local provincial level. So there is support. But it's in a qualified way. So again, another layer of complexity in the situation there, but it's not that they are completely disregarded. And I couldn't tell you whether that, I think there was a recent shift, whether that support includes financial dimension or not. So Tinzar, again, putting you on the spot there, but unless I did capture that sufficiently. In terms of the Ministry of Education support for the migrant learning centers?
Yes. So like you mentioned, Alice mentioned, now we have a local Ministry of Education, and then it's like province based government office and the Ministry of Education, and then so and they are also like referred as coordination center. So through their relationship and support, we can like that is how we can communicate and link with Thai government school, and then that is how we can like enroll the student from like migrant area to the Thai formal school. And also again with them, we also have like non-formal education, like a again local organization, and then it is also under like Ministry of Education. And then like with these like coordination, we just like set up a center like that migrant student or migrant youth can go in and then learn about non-formal education. So the teachers are under Ministry of Education, non-formal education office, and then but like we are just facilitating for them to expand their skills and capacity to accept like our student or our youth also. So in locally there are like some level of collaboration happening, but not at the national level yet. And also that is I see it like more relevant because these organization or these government office and people, they are also seeing the situation from the local, so they also understand, and then it allow through this like different organization and in institution involvement, it can make it like stay happen for now. I'm not sure like if this makes sense to you guys, Susan or Alice.
That makes sense to me. That was a terrific addition. Thank you so much. Look, there are some really great questions in the Q&A, and I feel bad to cut it off, and they're for all three of our speakers, so for Nuka and for Alex and for Mariska. So please, Buriska, so please, while the next panel is going on, if those speakers would like to answer, are they able to do that? Are they able to type straight in, or are speakers able to type roll? They are. That's great. Okay. So now I'd like to introduce Fauzan Farhana, who's going to introduce our next two speakers for our next little mini panel. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you, Prof. Susan. Distinguished participant, my name is Fauzan Farhana, and I will be the moderator for the second session. While in the first session, we already heard a lot about the right-based refugee governments in the case of Indonesia and Thailand, with the case of specific rights of education. Here, in the second session of this event, we will use a more specific lens to portray the community-led protection and the role of non-governmental organization in providing the rights protection for a refugee as well. So to discuss about this topic, we already have two distinguished and excellent speakers with us now. We have Tamara Mego from Sydney Southeast Asia Center, who will later present her research on community-led protection practices for refugees with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression in the community based on the case of Indonesia and Malaysia. And after that, Gading Gumilang Putra from GRS, Jesuit Refugee Services Indonesia, will also present his experience as a practitioners in this non-government organizations in providing protection as well for the rights of the refugee. So both of the speaker will have 15 minutes to present their presentation. And while they are speaking, I highly encourage you to also type any question that in your mind, so that later in the question and answer session we can directly answer the question. Okay, thank you. Without further ado, I give the floor to Tamara.
Thank you very much. And I'll be sharing today about sexual and gender minority refugees living in Southeast Asian cities. Really the relevance, I think, here is illustrating a bit more the intersectional dimensions that Alex touched upon as well in her presentation. So myself, I just wanted to draw attention to Swaka, who's one of the research partners in Indonesia, and also Britain that supported my fieldwork as part of my PhD studies when I was in Indonesia in 2023. And I also visited to Malaysia and to Thailand as part of this research. So I'm talking here about queer refugees that face even higher levels of discrimination and violence due to their diverse SOGI. And persecution that's based on one's real or perceived SOGI can be grounds for claiming asylum. However, individuals may not feel safe to disclose their identity or claim on that basis. They face particular threats to human rights due to their non-heteronormative identities. And this may be a driver of migration, often combined with other drivers. And there are politically motivated homophobic and transphobic sentiments in Malaysia and in Indonesia. Queer refugees may face exclusion from protection services. So although we've talked about exclusion in general, or let's say lack of sufficient service coordination, this group is particularly marginalized because of their identities. And there has been some burgeoning research already sensitive to experience of refugees with diverse SOGI. However, it's usually been focused on those who are resettling in the global north. And I've become aware through this research that the opportunities for resettlement are actually quite low, and acknowledging that reality that most forced migrants and refugees in the region will stay in the region, and they don't have promises of resettlement to them, especially since countries like the US have shut down those opportunities. Focus on Southeast Asia, that's host to large numbers of forcibly displaced people in these three cities of Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, and Bangkok. So my question was around how can sexual and gender minority refugees become intelligible and visible to protection stakeholders so they can advocate for their human rights and reach services in Southeast Asia? So here I'm talking about how do they become known when it's a group that experiences discrimination for how they express themselves and how they are perceived by others in this political context. So often refugees will learn to turn their multifaceted experiences into coherent stories based on their minority identity. So they might focus on an ethnic identity, or they might focus on a sexual identity, but rarely in the system is there space for both to be recognized. And this can erase their complex life narratives and diverse identities.
as they attempt to make themselves known to humanitarian actors. And these recognition of identities is subjective to an individual who may have had to hide or deny their identity. And in a moment, I'll illustrate that a bit more. But just to note from a gender and sexual perspective of research or queer studies, that we would see that there are multiple and fluid identities that are context dependent, and that certain queer refugee groups are visible while others remain hidden. So this was research with a group of people that largely remain hidden, which came along with a lot of challenges with accessibility and ethical complications, and has been really worthwhile. So I did qualitative focus group discussions and individual interviews with refugees with diverse SOGI, with protection stakeholders and refugee-led organisations in a kind of life worlds analysis. I'll share with you some of my selected findings. They're mostly from refugees that are living in Kuala Lumpur at the time of the research. So I'll just read part of this out, aware of time. So within the refugee community itself, if you are an LGBTQ, it's quite the risk, especially if you're from the Arab community. A couple of Somalian refugees who are LGBTQ, and the moment the community finds out about it, they often were physically abused or verbally abused. They were kicked out of the house that they were sharing with another family, for example. So really, they bring you to shame that, you know, you're from this community or Muslim background. How can you be LGBTQ as well? And it's very hard to find support from other community for this specific incidents because they're fearful. They're scared of coming up or coming out as well. So we'll find closeted LGBTQ within the refugee community itself, especially if they still need to depend on their community for support. So what Mohammed's talking about here is a common theme of how refugees rely on their own community of origin in the country they've moved to for support. And there's not a lot of other avenues for support aside from that community. And here's a couple of other anecdotes that share around being hidden. So Ali, he came from Guinea and experienced generalized racism and was targeted by law enforcement officers for being an undocumented worker in Malaysia. So he worked in Malacca for 3 months, only receiving 1 month of his salary before immigration was called on him. He then escaped to Kuala Lumpur and worked in Sabah before getting caught in police raids again. Another example from Kadir, he, instead of going out to seek work, he stayed hidden to avoid detection. He said, I was really scared to communicate with them. I mean, I don't mix with them, that is Malaysian people. I keep myself away because I'm scared a lot. I never had issues with the general public except the police. They will tell you, if you don't pay this money, we will take you to the police station and then you'll be deported. And they're asking for bribes as well. So this kind of theme is around how the institutions which should be protecting rights and the law are often actors that are exploiting individuals as well. And there is not a lot of connection between the refugee individuals and with the Malaysian society in this particular example. I wouldn't say that's the case for all refugees. There are a lot of organizations which are really mixed and supportive, but this is particularly for those with diverse SOGI. And this is from Tami, non-binary refugee. In a country like Malaysia, let alone about support, just being you is a threat. So I was so conflicted, even to accept myself, because you can't be visible. You can be, you know, sentenced to something, punished in prison and all of that for being you. So I've never come across, including UNHCR and other INGO that I work with, local and all these organizations are ever mentioning about, you know, you are safe here. I was thinking, had I known that UNHCR would have considered LGBTQ refugees to be as one of the vulnerable groups, I should have sought for protection a bit earlier. So this was something that I commonly heard as well, that they weren't aware of the protection that was available. Now I'm going to skip through to some reflections. So through this research, I found that the social stigma towards the LGBTIQ community is amplified for migrants and refugees, as they also experience xenophobia. In cities like Bangkok, where there is more acceptance of LGBTIQ people, refugees from these minority groups still experience discrimination due to their status as undocumented migrants or refugees. So in that situation, that identity is actually forefront. Some refugee service providers have received training on diverse SOGI issues, but have mixed expertise. There are civil society organisations that provide support in validating claims and promoting cases and linking with emergency shelter and health support. And this is ad hoc support that was highlighted by by Riska's presentation earlier. There are cases where individuals with diverse SOGI are referred to UNHCR for prioritised assistance or expedited resettlement to another country. And I am aware that now Australia has a program like this that's piloted right now for expedited resettlement to a country that recognises LGBTIQ rights. This highlighted for me that inclusive intake and outreach services are really important, so that people feel safe to be able to disclose, and so they know what assistance will be available to them if they do make that risky disclosure. And just drawing some conclusions, that access to protection services is not uniform for all refugees and asylum seekers due to intersecting systems of marginalisation. Vulnerability of refugees with diverse SOGI is exacerbated by their relative invisibility if they are without relationships of support and solidarity. Being out in public can often be dangerous and debilitating for refugees with diverse SOGI, particularly those who have visible expression of transness or non-binary identities. Similar human rights concerns of people with diverse SOGI, whether economic, irregular or forced migrants. So the category of refugee becomes a little bit less firm or static when seeing that these different groups have very similar experiences, particularly in Thailand, in locations like Mysot. And needs strengthening of comprehensive regulations for responding to refugees with diverse SOGI and addressing persecution. But we also need implementation of these regulations, which requires transformation of attitudes and social norms. So I'm of the view that having regulations or laws themselves is not enough, but it requires a sort of whole of society transformation. Advocates might draw on CEDAW, which is around anti-discrimination, and the Yogyakarta Principles +10, which is on the application of international human rights law in relation to SOGI-esque. Thanks very much. And I just forgot one more slide here. So the operating space of humanitarian organisations can be influenced by the preferences of the state and social tolerance of diversity. Humanitarian actors need to do more to create safer spaces for refugees with diverse SOGI to feel welcomed, protected and supported. And protection programs would be more effective if refugees' nuanced needs were known and there was more representation in decision making. Thanks for listening. I hope some of those thoughts have been helpful for you and for the general panel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tamara. It's very insightful. Yeah, sadly, we say that sexual orientation, gender identity, and experience is actually what makes us human. But then when we talk about human rights, it often or most of the time, people will react as it's something else, not not as the people as not the same level as humans. So yeah, thank you for the presentation, and probably Mr. Gading will also share his experience as the practitioner in GRS Indonesia. And without further ado, I give the floor for Mr. Gading.
Thank you very much, Ma Ojang. A very good morning, everyone. Just want to check again, can you see my screen okay? Can you hear
Yes.
me? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, clear,
Great.
and I can see the presentation as well.
Great. Thank you, Pusat Riset Politik, the Center, Research Center for Politics from BRIN, as well as Sydney Southeast Asia Center from University of Sydney for having me here. It's great to see some familiar faces as well. Prof. Tangki, Prof. Luka, Mbak Tika, Mbak Ojang, Mbak Ida, and fellow speakers. Today, for the next 15 minutes, I believe I will share about GRS role on the empowerment, refugee empowerment. Yeah, and it's very interesting title on the right-based refugee governance, and I think throughout the previous discussion, we touched about right-based, which is for, I think I'm probably the only speaker coming from NGO here. It's very interesting because on daily basis, I think we often receive requests and feedback from the refugees, especially in Indonesian context, where someone is not even recognized as, I think it's primarily unrighted groups and human rights groups as rights holder. Hence, if they're not recognized as people, then how can we actually hold accountable, or even ask for accountability, or even obligation of the parent, basically. So I think that that's all bit about how taboo it is to discuss even about the rights. I think that's the nuance of the discussion that I will share later as well on rights. But it is, I think it's a really good starting point if we start having discussion on rights, especially with the current context. On GRS Indonesia, I'm going to share a bit on the we are, as well as the role that we do that is relevant with the topic, is that we are faith-based and local operation humanitarian organization with mission of company serving an very forcibly displaced person. We've been a presence in Indonesia in various settings, including urban area and centers, by providing support, cash-based assistance, access to medical service, as well as policy advocacy, which we consider to be a privilege because in Indonesian context, to also share is that mainly organizations working on refugees are in humanitarian nature, rather in advocacy or human rights. There are some who actually work specifically focused on that, but the number is very limited. The current service and collaboration with South Sudan refugees are based in Bogor, Jakarta, and Aceh at the moment, with the setting of emergency and what we call waiting setting. In 2022 until 2024, specifically on the aspect of empowerment, self-reliance, GRS took part on National Advocacy Initiative on Livelihood, along with BRIN and others, as well as set up a program of community empowerment for with experience on livelihood activities, capacity program, and community picture since 2014. So I'll share.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Yeah.
Gading. Sorry
Yeah.
for interrupting, but your sound is a little bit
Far?
yeah,
Okay.
a little bit far. So
Can you hear me better now?
now this one
Okay.
is better. Thank you.
Okay. In terms of refugee context and challenges in Indonesia surrounding empowerment and self-reliance, the first one has been elaborated with Ibu Nuka earlier, with the lack of comprehensive national policies and awareness from the awareness of refugee reality from policy some rights-related, I wouldn't say rights-based framework, but it's a rights-related framework might exist, but operational implementation and costs are mainly shouldered by the refugee community, international organization, and humanitarian organization. The narrative for policy change heavily influenced by assumption. Incidental event of using refugees as electoral purpose unfortunately happened as well in Indonesia, resulting in misinformation, disinformation, and others. And it also brings a setback on the advocacy of empowerment and self-reliance. The use of humanitarian narrative in lieu of human rights has been explored earlier by the previous speaker that was also being asked by one of the participants, basically framing refugee issues mainly as charity or emergency aid concern. That's what humanitarian means, meaning that it's not a matter of legal rights and justice. Hence, the accountability system might not be there. The non-state party of the Refugee Convention often used as an excuse. Meanwhile, all of the rest of the human rights framework that has been ratified are pretty much not really being used. The various interpretation, and this is the next point, of human rights, let alone right-based approach in Indonesia, especially there is a various interpretation of human rights, let alone the right-based approach in Indonesia and potentially in ASEAN, especially with the word of national security, public morality, and regional and national context in the text of declaration. So I think this is also another challenge in how can you actually call a human rights in ASEAN and Indonesia. The next one is dependency on international organization, a lack of regional cooperation and profit-sharing mechanism in the international fora, including ASEAN countries, and trend of externalization, expulsion, and exclusion. I wouldn't elaborate this further from the global north practice that happens in Indonesia. I think Professor Bangki earlier has mentioned about what Australia can do more about it. Involvement of CSO and NGO humanitarian agency does occur, but participation and coordination goals might be limited, including the meaningful participation. I think the previous speaker mentioned about increasing the participation of refugees. And last but not least is the limited funds, type of service, and framework for refugee-led organization or initiative and organization that support them. And this is true on the empowerment and self-reliance, which creates a daily basis to receive requests on homelessness, access to gas, survive, and the daily story of unrealized hope on family reunification, resettlement, and other long-term solutions. However, there might be some opportunity that we see is that the access to self-reliance is becoming more and more pragmatic solution for the current issue. I think several articles shows about it. The first one was in 2017 by Atin and Yunizar from UGM on access to work, and I think being strengthened after one of the article from Anja Mispa and I think from Nino who visited Aceh and showing how self-reliance is becoming more and more pragmatic, so not even right-based. Indonesia have quite complete experience and learning in the refugee living model. We've got experience on detention, homelessness, camp setting with limited freedom of movement, designated shelter with some freedom of movement, and open setting with social cohesion. And one of the learning outcomes that thankfully detention is no longer a norm in refugees. Growing spirit to take ownership, awareness, initiative, and collaboration on cooperation or burden sharing mechanism at the national level are there. There was practices of government, international organization, NGO model, advocacy model for policy engagement. There is NGO refugee-led organization for rights fulfillment and service, while the duty bearer of them. And there is a growing number of refugee-led initiative and organization in Indonesia, despite limited framework and support that they receive. Moral, religious, and humanitarian culture and practice of hospitality and charity by Indonesian people can still be found. I wouldn't say that it's 100% inclusive, but it's still there. It can go beyond just what's in it for us or cost-benefit analysis when looking at refugees. So that's some of the modality. Another opportunity, although this might be a note for the academia communities, that especially on the empowerment and livelihood or self-reliance, that it's been a while that we haven't seen research on it. The last one was in 2017, 2018, and then further explored, but it was more on social cohesion in 2022. However, we see increasing roles of academia, collaboration, and engagement with refugee community and humanitarian organizations. Okay, I have 5 more minutes, and the next slide is on the what JRS really experienced on this, and this is reflecting. This is a self-reflection and self-learning as well from JRS. Is that we started with the full direct basic services, practically a cash-based assistance. It includes access to medical service, access to psychosocial activities for quite a while. And I think other organizations, and primarily UNHCR and IOM, pretty much doing the same thing. And it creates quite a big dependency from the refugees to international organization, as well as the dependency from the government to the international organization as well. Then we start learning about community empowerment along with the momentum of growing number of the refugee-led organization. So we still provide basic needs for those who are vulnerable, but during this timeline of learning process, we identify and support refugee champions, engage and collaborate with refugee-led initiative and community. And I think there's sometimes in 2014 when we start realize about our capacity building could actually lead or capacity building program could actually lead to self-reliance. And then in 2025, we go beyond and start seeing the empowerment and collaboration of refugees are not only seen as an effort of advocating and fulfillment of basic rights, but also part of MHPS as intervention, with the goal to acknowledge refugees. So the way we define this, and one of the learning curve that we had, is that the community empowerment is an approach and process of renegotiating power for refugee communities, and that require us to realize that there is a power dynamics, that there is a power difference with refugees and us as NGO who mainly work as a humanitarian organizations, because they really have to make requests and under our waiting list for a long time, and that creates a different level of power. And by doing the empowerment, is that we actually change the point of view and making sure that we can strengthen the resilience of the refugees through collaboration, active participation, capacity building, and provision of partial material support to maintain livelihood and ecosystem. These are several key aspects that we use through the community empowerment program, but I just want to touch on the aspect of trust, collaboration, active participation, equality, strengthening capacity, and accountability. This is a learning process. We are not yet there on the refugee meaningful participation program, but that's something that we try to actually work on daily basis. Especially, again, we are very lucky with the first mission that we have on the accompaniment, which require us to be present on a daily basis at the field. And this is the last slide for me, which is the key takeaways. For the policymaker, we feel that try to increase awareness and discern on evidence-based policy analysis as a first step in respecting, protecting, and fulfilling refugee rights through policy. For the academic community, consider to have a formal academia network for forced displacement at the national level. The reason why I put the word national level here, sometimes in the advocacy, it's not merely about what, but also about how. And by supporting the national level with the support from the region, that's apparently how things are being conducted on, especially on the human rights setting in Indonesia, or at least on the refugee policy in Indonesia. Strengthen direct collaboration with the government and refugee communities to co-create innovative protection models and continue generating evidence-based research. The reason I put it here is because generally organizations like us or humanitarian organizations spend most of the time in either dealing with the limited funds, especially with the current context, or with the typical programming that they already done. So the intervention from academia of fresh mind and ideas from the academia to both government and those who actually provide protection on the implementation practice will be very helpful. The next one is for human rights organization or institution to promote inclusivity by engaging refugee-led and humanitarian organizations in the rights monitoring and advocacy mechanism. As I mentioned earlier, that generally in Indonesia, main organizations who work on refugee issues are humanitarian organizations. So a bridge needs to be built between human rights and humanitarian agencies here. And in the human rights setting, I think it's good to mention not only the NGO but also the human rights institution, the government human rights. Meanwhile, for humanitarian organizations, recognize the power dynamics and ensure meaningful participation and inclusion of refugees. May be considered to embrace right-based approach programming and advocacy, so it's slightly beyond need-based approach and charity-based approach. And for the donors, collaborate with policymakers, academia, and other donors to deliver efficient, longer-term, and sustainable, but also structural response. And for the refugee community, actively participate in national and regional policy discussion. Collaborate in collective advocacy, highlight resilience, and explore alternative solutions alongside regional pathways. While the local communities, private sector, and international communities acknowledge refugee potential contribution to society, stay informed, and speak potentially with the policymaker and be part of the solution, including expanding protection space by opening resettlement, family reunion, and other, creative pathways for solutions to ensure that the refugees can still be protected and included under the structural change on the policy as well. Thank you very much, and over to you, Pak Ojang.
Process in protecting the rights of refugee in Indonesia. Okay, so before we moved on to the Q&A session. Oh, sorry. Before I saw that there are someone who raised hand for the Q&A session, but seems like it's already passed. So we move to the question and answer session. We have already several questions where Tamara is currently typing. Okay, so there is one question from anonymous attendees about Tamara. Based on your response, are you saying that refugee being part of LGBTQ plus community do not have to do with seeking protection as is not acknowledged or addressed, but their legal status in the host country in the main factors? Would you like to answer the question directly?
Sure,
Yeah.
thank you. If I understand the question correctly, it's about clarifying what I mean by talking about these refugees that are part of the LGBTIQ community. I'm saying that they do seek protection, like other refugees or asylum seekers, and they can also benefit from this comprehensive legal frameworks with access to education, health, like other refugees. What I was aiming to highlight through this focus is that individuals which have particular identities like diverse sexual and gender orientation, they will have more challenges with accessing their rights. And it's important for protection stakeholders like NGOs and UNHCR to do reach out to these groups and to make it known that there are safe ways of accessing protection and specialized assistance because their needs are different from the general refugee population. Thanks.
Okay. Hope this answered the question. And then, because probably Mr. Gading is the last speakers, so the question is coming actually from Tamara. How to promote self-reliance and resilience when refugees don't have right for works, access credit, or higher education in Indonesia? I think you can answer.
Yeah, thank you. I think it applies for every other rights, including education, given that the rights is not being regulated or recognized in Indonesia. No, I mean the education is about circular letter. It's not really a policy or a guarantee of the rights. So the way I usually answer this question is one, the advocacy for policy change and recognition of the rights should still be there. Meanwhile, that it means that we are still focusing on the duty bearer. But however, in the other hand, under the humanitarian foreign policy that Indonesia do, then keeping or generating a model of protection, including self-reliance. So in this specific case would be internship model, apprenticeship model, maybe having a collaboration with university to actually, can you actually provide a credit with a model, maybe with the students, and later bring that up to the policy maker. That would be something bottom up that we can also do. So generating the model first and then bringing up. Meanwhile, at the same time, then reminding they to be better about the obligation. Yeah, but first they need to be aware first. You know, you cannot remind somebody that they're not aware of the obligation. Thank you.
You. There is also three more questions that can actually answered by all the speakers, but especially for Mr. Gading, who works in the refugee protection. There is a question about, is there any case finding about refugee disguised as tourists or digital nomad or acting like broker for human trafficking network, especially those who settle in tourist spots in Indonesia and Thailand? And so also similar question about, is there any of the refugee or asylum seeker that are involved in crimes against humanity or groups that are considered to threaten national security? So yeah, again, there is what do you say, mixed situation, complex situation between their legal status and also their hidden agenda or something like. Okay, can you answer the question first, Mr. Gading?
Thank you, Mbak Osan. I don't think it really makes, and it's often, to be completely frank, I think it's often used as a stigma and in Asia, which is quite dangerous. First, I mean, when we talk about refugees, it's a clear definition. There's a clear definition of refugees. It means somebody that needs protection. I wouldn't go as far as the definition, but even Indonesia itself has the presidential regulation that outline the definition itself. And there is UNHCR who actually conduct refugee status determination on that. So when somebody receives a refugee status, it means they need protection. Yeah, that's one. So regardless their situation in Indonesia, if they fulfill that RSD and they actually pass if they are recognized, then they are refugees. Second, if they are actually committing a gross human rights violation, for instance, and there is a particular point under the human rights, under the refugee law on the exclusion, meaning that once actually they go for refugee status determination, they wouldn't be considered as refugees. So it's quite clear definition and mechanism under international law, and most importantly that they are not, when they actually live in Indonesia, probably elsewhere, the law still applies to them. The local law still applies to them, meaning that if they commit any crimes, then they can still go to the due process for the legal justice system. But please note that if they actually pass the definition, it means that they are recognized as a refugee. It's not even granted, it's recognized, meaning that they're already refugees when they actually left the home. It's just it just happened that later they met with UNHCR and they recognized them. That's why UNHCR even is not in position to grant that. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Do you have take on this, Tamara, as well?
Yeah, I would support how Gading responded to that question. I think in terms of those who might be studying or enter on tourist visas and then seeking to translate those to to refugee recognition. That's up to particular circumstances of the individuals. Yeah.
Okay. And there is also one interesting question about the which level that will be benefit for refugee protection, to improve refugee protection. Is it the local, national, or regional level? So I think both of you can answer this question before we move that to the closing part of our event today. Maybe you can, you want to answer this first, Tamara?
I might just push the question to Professor Susan as instead. Thank you. I'm aware you
Okay.
need to leave soon, so if you've got comments on that, thanks.
Likewise, I'll probably pass that questions to Prof. Nuka. I think that they best would actually answer this question. Thank you.
Yeah, thankfully we have two professors here to answer the difficult question. But before we close this session, if I can take from both of the speaker, we can see that community-led protection and assistance of non-governmental organization, as well as the civil society, is remain limited, and therefore there is a call for a more sustainable and comprehensive governance that will focus more on the dignity of the refugee as a human being. Of course, we can use the multi-stakeholder and human rights approach that's already been studied for a long time. But at the end of the day, we saw that the protection for human can be realized if we address them as a human being as well. So with that, I give the floor to Professor Susan for the closing remarks and conclusion and answer. Okay.
Thank you so much. What I have left to say is simply that this has been a wonderful panel. I really want to thank all five of our speakers, Nuka and Rizka and Tamara and Gading and Rizka. It was really wonderful and Alex, sorry. And I think we can draw from these presentations really a sense of the ways in which in all of these situations, the agency of refugees, the possibility of using community-led initiatives really seems to be part of the solutions. We know this to be the case because of the ad hoc solutions to which many of you referred. And yet we know that those ad hoc solutions are not necessarily the best way. Nevertheless, if we go back to Caitlin McCaffrey's excellent question, which was actually the question I was hoping to conclude with, so thank you so much, Fadzan, for getting right to that at the end. I think what my unsatisfying answer is that we need all three levels, because some of the ways that you get at creative solutions from refugees themselves, an understanding of the tensions that may exist between communities, hosts and hosts and refugees themselves, the way that those interact with national bodies, or how we may recruit regional mechanisms in the future. We need to be aware of the many spatial, political, and economic contexts and geopolitical contexts that feed in. So, I think our speakers did an extraordinary job talking about what is happening on the local level and how those interact with regional, national, especially contexts, but also no regional ones. But I conclude, as we really do need to close out now, I conclude by saying, we are unfortunately not in the best of times. We find ourselves, those of us that care about refugee rights, we find ourselves strangled at all levels by geopolitical forces outside of our control. And I think that where possible, we have to be working on all levels to ensure that we offer the kinds of empowerment, protection, and frameworks that honor and provide resilience and protection for refugees that we can. With that, I'd really like to close. I'd like to thank our amazing speakers for just a richness for theory and empirics that all came together. And I will just say, Gading, I really appreciate your call for what academics can do. I'm hoping that today is a little bit of that, creating the kinds of networks that we need to spark more conversations, to create the networks that we need so that researchers and policymakers are speaking to each other. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to answer all the questions. I have to jump off, but I'm really happy if you want, Tamara, I'm happy for you to leave it open because I see many questions remain in the chat, how you'd like to proceed from here.
Thanks so much, Susan. And I'll let you leave there. I know you've got another engagement. Thank you so much. If the other speakers want to stay for a few more minutes, you're welcome, but I know it's been a couple of hours already.
Thank you. I'm sorry, everybody. I have to go as well, but it's been really great to begin these discussions and to hear about all of your really excellent work. So I look forward to continuing on. And thank you, Tamara, and everybody for organizing and hosting and a great audience participants. Hopefully we'll get to engage with you again too in the future.